This is Thorin for OnGamers, and I'm here to do an overview video for the piece I've just published, which is the top 40 5-man lineups in Counter-Strike 1.0 to 1.6 history by prize money won in a single year. Now, in the past, I already did one where it was the top 60 5-man lineups just by total prize money won with that 5-man lineup. Now I've narrowed it down a bit, and this time it's just a 5-man lineup in a single year, because we all remember a lot of years were defined by one team dominating. So Fnatic 2009, when they had Gux and they had Get Right winning almost everything, of course they're up there. Of course they won a lot of prize money. We think of some of the years when the Poles would win 1 or 2 majors and they win a lot of money. Where do they stack up? We think of Navi's domination towards the end. We think of the early days. We had teams like NIP, we had teams like SK Sweden, Heaton and Potty combo, always winning stuff, always winning a lot of money, always dominating. So I thought to myself, it'd be interesting to see just by years who had the best years in terms of prize money. Now then, let's start there actually, because obviously the point of these overview videos is, in theory, if you're interested in a topic, you'll go to the article and just read that, because it's more in depth, it's more articulate, there's more information, it's better constructed. In this video though, I'll give you some aspects of that, but I also am going to give you some stuff that isn't in the article, so it has its own merits, and then kind of you can decide where you go from there. So let's start off with a topic that I don't address in it, which is it even valid to list them by year and by prize money won? Now, I've kind of alluded there to a reason as to why. Okay, in general, just sheer prize money won does not tell you how great a team was. With that said, as a general trend, it's very rare, and as you'll see from this list, when you look at the top 10, these are all incredible teams. These really are all the greatest teams of all time. They'd all be in the top 20 of all time, greatest lineups. So okay, yeah, a single tournament can't define it. So for example, when Emulate won that WCG, a lot of money, off the top of my head, it'd probably be like 40,000, I think maybe. Or 50,000 even. That's a lot of money. They're not one of the all-time greatest teams though. They never proved it afterwards. They didn't have the consistency. The players weren't of the caliber, aside from maybe MSX, of the great players of all time. But as a general trend, the good thing about Counter-Strike, when we had such a big circuit as opposed to just 1 or 2 events, the big circuits meant that the teams who were able to show consistency, which is how you really show that you're a great player, were able to rack up this prize money, and as a result, it's more of a novelty to see where they rank up just by prize money, but it's one way of ranking the greatest teams of all time. Now then, what I'll do first of all is I'll talk about one of the teams on the list. So the one I'll pick out of the list that I did on here would be I'll go for Fnatic 2006, because this is one that I think is more of a surprising lineup, that it's so high initially, even if you're a big hardcore fan of CS. Because okay, Fnatic 2009, when they got Gux and Get Right, they won everything, that makes sense. That should be very high up. Fnatic 2007, for the last 6 months, they were the best team. They were winning nearly every event. They were placing top 2 every event. This all makes sense. Fnatic 2006, let me give you the context of Fnatic at this time. Fnatic lineup that you're thinking of with the core Fnatic, Forest, DSN, Khan, and then this lineup, they had Archie and Tentpole. This lineup only had been formed in January of that year. Before that, Fnatic wasn't a big name in CS. It had some, like an okay Swedish team for a while in 2005, that was it. Those players weren't even big name players. Tentpole and Forest were members of this Big Rip team who were kind of a fluke one-hit wonder, where they won the WEG World Esports Games Season 2 in Korea. That was kind of considered a fluke, and some of the best teams didn't go because it lasted a month. It was in Korea. So no one really thought of these as like the great upcoming players. In 2006, here's the key thing to understand. Even though they're going to be high up on this list when you see it, they weren't even the best team of the year. In fact, they weren't even close. At the time, Fnatic always used to lose to NIP, the team that had Heaton, it had Spawn, it had Roban, it had Vale, it had Zet, and it had Inns, actually, who'd later on go to be on in Fnatic. This lineup always got the better of them in their inter matchup, in the domestic matchup there, and in big tournaments beat them. And NiP were the one winning all the tournaments. They were winning a number of tournaments throughout, and then the Poles came in late at the end of the year and won a couple of big tournaments. And so overall, and you had the Finns were always hanging around 3rd or 4th. People were looking at Fnatic, and the thing with the Fnatic team was they were a team who clearly had the talent and a good core, because they were getting these placings. They were getting top 2, top 3. They would never win though. They would always lose in the big tournaments. Big major finals, ESWC final, WSVG top 3, finally, at the end of the year, it all came together, and they were finally, for at least that week, they were the best team in the world. They won CPL Winter Event in December of 2006, and finally it came together and they won. Now, the key thing is, if they only won one huge tournament, and yeah, they had a lot of top placings, how are they so high on this list? Well, the key thing to understand is that 2006 was one of the most competitive years ever in terms of not just top teams, but also the size of the circuit and the prize money on offer. So off the top of my head, I usually go the most competitive years in terms of the most tournaments and the most to be won. I usually would rank them 2008 first. I'd probably say 2006 second, and then third I'd go 2010. So any team that has a really strong showing in those years, you'll see on this list, has a really good chance of showing up. And that's actually why this Fnatic team was so high. Now, there's one team I've given you here. And actually, I'll tell you a bit about that team then, since the article obviously doesn't go into this. So in that team, here's an interesting fact that I always like to mention it like this because it always shocks people. You think of Forest now, you think the most skilled player maybe ever in Counter-Strike, the best aim ever in Counter-Strike, the most effective aim ever in Counter-Strike, an incredible player. Surely once he was on a top team, he was going to tournaments, he was thought of as the best player. Not at all. In 2006, he was the equivalent of someone like, let me think of what a good analogy now would be. Maybe someone like Guardian last year, or maybe Olof M in 2013. He was like clearly a very skilled player, and some games he'd go crazy and people were like, wow, this is going to be the next guy. But he hadn't yet established himself as he's on that world-class level. And here's the key reason why, because even in Sweden, he wasn't the best player. In 2006, Zet was the best player. Zet was what Forrest became. He was the player with the godlike aim who every single game, even losses, it seemed like he'd do that crazy shot and have a round where he almost won it in amazing fashion, or he'd get the 2 kills every round, and he could seemingly do whatever he wanted. He could push up all the time, the aggression. So in many ways, Forrest was like a subpar Zet at the time. He wasn't able to quite do it on the biggest stage. Obviously, later on, he would become that, and he would even supersede and surpass what Zet had ever done and become a much, much better player. But at the time, he wasn't the other members of the team. Now, here's where it gets funny, because again, the context of all these players is different from how you probably remember them if you saw them at the end of their careers. People are going to think, if I say Forrest, DSN, Khan, Archie, Tentpole, okay, second best player in this team, probably going to be DSN, maybe someone would think, who was from the middle era of Fnatic, if they remember that, because DSN later on would become the second star. No, no, no. In this team, the second best player was Tentpole. And Tentpole was this kind of all-around player. I'd describe him now as a player like Shox. Now, his level wasn't quite in the context of 1.6 or what Shox can be in CSGO, but in the case of he could do everything in the game. He could win your clutch rounds. He could just frag for you. He could get the opening kills. He could get the clutch kills at the end of the round. He could use seemingly every gun. He could use the FAMAS, the Colt. He could use the pistols. He just had really good nerve under pressure. He had a good attitude. This was a guy who could just do it all. So he really was the second star. And at the time, since Forrest hadn't fully gone supernova, I'd say him and Forrest were kind of like sharing a similar level of strength. They were the carries of the team. Then, yes, DSN, you would put him as the third star at the time. His AWPing was getting picked up a bit. His rifles were decent. He was a solid player he'd had some good performances the last few years, but he'd never been elite level in Sweden quite. Then Khan, interestingly, people from the end of his career, people are going to think of Khan and think, oh, he sucks, he wasn't very good. No, at the time, Khan was one of the best fraggers of all the in-game leaders. And he had a loose style. At the time, Khan was more like an Exist type guy. Maybe not quite the level Exist has been early on in CSGO, but now, where he is right now, that's about where Khan would be. And then Archie, he was just a guy who's the support player. He's the utility player, just does a bit of everything. He just was there as the fifth guy. It wasn't really as important. Now, what's interesting is later on, obviously these players would shift again because Tentpole went to SK and became a real carry there and was more of a star. Kind of reminded me of when Gux would later leave Fnatic for SK and show himself as more of a star than a team player. DSN, crucially, when Tentpole left and they brought in Inns is another support player, so they needed more fragging, more power. So this is where DSN the next year really stepped it up, and he became much more of a dominant AWPer. His rifles, crucially, got a lot better, and he actually, in 2007, he legit was in the top 10 players in the world. That's actually why they were able to become the best team in the world in 2007. Okay, there's a team that I've kind of given you already that's on the list, but some different information. I'll talk to you about one now that isn't on this list, just because they didn't have literally enough prize money, but is an all-time great team. And so if we're just talking about all-time great teams and we're in that mood, here's one we could discuss. So I would go with this team called Eastro, and they were a South Korean team, and their year was in 2008. Again, one of the most competitive years ever. I actually did an article about them for Fragbite a while ago. If you look it up, Eastro 2008, Thorin, Fragbite, you'll probably find it on Google. This team was a really fun team because here's the context. In South Korea, they've never given a fuck about FPS games in general. And then they do play some FPS games, but it was always FPS games that you could pirate, because the key thing is those PC bang is how they say it. You have to have the game has to be one that you can copy onto every machine. It can't be one that costs $60 for each game and you have to put it on each, because otherwise a small PC cafe can't afford to kit everyone out with it and then only charge you like $1 an hour to play. So as a result, okay, yeah, you're thinking to yourself, well, in the early days, CS could be done like that because you could just copy the Half-Life over and do it on every machine. That's actually true, although you'd need a key to play online. In theory, you could have played on LAN. But later on, you couldn't do it that way. Whereas in Asia, the model's always been free to play. So they had like Crossfire, they had Sudden Attack, all these games that were rip-offs of Counter-Strike, made in Korea actually, and that's what their popular games were. So crucially, in Korea, it goes like this. At the time, Brood War and RTS games were #1 by far. Then you had FPS way down, but even then it wasn't CS. So the point I'm going to make here is, even amongst the small community of FPS players in South Korea, very few played Counter-Strike, and then people who did play Counter-Strike, almost none of them played on Steam, because again, you couldn't pirate it. And then the ones who played on Steam were only really the players who were at the top of the competitive scene and who wanted to be pros and wanted to go to events and play on Steam and big tournaments like against Forest and all those guys. So you had such a small amount of people, and you'd think to yourself, you could never have a great team, never have a team who could potentially win a major event out of this, or even be consistently good. And yet you had this core lineup that was Project KR before, then Eastro, then later on went on to be on We Made Fox. You actually had Lunatic High as well, but this was the real main team, the real chance they had to be world class. And the reason why is because of the efficacy of that training method. They lived in a team house. They practiced all the time. They practiced crazy amounts. They didn't have a lot of many good players to play against. They could sometimes play their Chinese teams. They could play the other Korean teams. They didn't have many people to play. So what they would do was they would literally run through dry run strats in an empty server. And that's why if you ever go and look up on YouTube, Eastro 2008 strat, you'll find they had these incredibly meticulous strategies where as every person in the strat comes around, he knows his timing of when he has to hit this corner, because 1 second earlier while he's looking this way, the pop flash goes off and blinds his enemy. Then he turns around and he's not blind, but his enemy is, and he could shoot him and he takes over that area, and then his teammate knows when to follow up. They took this very methodical training style that Koreans had for Brood War, now they're using in League of Legends, StarCraft 2, that's made them the best in the world by far, and they applied it to Counter-Strike with this limited talent pool. And here's a crucial thing, you did have a genius. South Korean Counter-Strike had its genius, it had its Neo, it had its MSX, and this guy's name was Solo. And this guy was an incredible carry player, but crucially, in different eras of his team, depending on the level of skill, the level of strats, the level of team players, he actually learned to make his game so complete and all round that he could shift his role within games and within eras and within lineups to fit what they needed. And as a result, they were able to always be a good team and capable of upsets. But in 2008, they went for it, man. They made it to the final of IEM Season 2 finals. They only, if we're being honest, they only lost that final because the maps were ridiculous. It was like Cobble, and then... No, okay, so here's the key thing. It wasn't another map, that's why I got confused. It was Dust 2 and Cobble. And the reason why this is significant is, first of all, Mousesports and German teams were always awesome on Dust 2, so you were never going to beat Mousesports in the final on that. And then the decider was Cobble, and Cobble wasn't used very much as a competitive map. That had been thrown out ages ago. It was weird that it was even in this map pool, and then even worse, there's no way these Eastro players were able to get practice on that. They just weren't. And so unfortunately, they lost in that final. In terms of how they played at that tournament, I think they should have won it. I hate using that term, but on any of the maps, I think they would have won that tournament. And this would have been a world championship level for a South Korean team in Counter-Strike, in Europe no less. Europe's the home of Counter-Strike and top level all-time great teams, as you'll see from this list, which is nearly all Europeans. Then later on in the year, they get to the final of ESWC, another major tournament. And what happens to them there? They go through this incredible series against the Poles, and the final map is Tuscan. Again, a map they don't know. They don't know this map. They lose in really close fashion, 16-13 on that map. Oh, they get denied a second major. The point I'm making here is this team really had a chance to be multiple world championships despite all the insane context. And so they definitely are one of the greatest teams ever. Now then, prize money-wise, they weren't enough to get into the top 10 of my list here. They're on the top 40. But I thought it'd be an interesting side topic there to give you something extra in this video. So the article is about the top 40 5-man lineups in Counter-Strike history, not counting CSGO. I might do something like that later. From CS 1.0 to 1.6, so about 11, 12 years of history. And we have a look, where are they just by prize money won in a single year. There's the key thing, in a single year. A calendar year as well, not just 12 months, a calendar year.